So pawns make up 50% of all the pieces on a chessboard, and yet despite that, a lot of people tend to underestimate them and really misunderstand how to best use their pawns. That's a big mistake, because if you know how to use your pawns, you can gain some nice advantages over your opponent. In this video, I'm going to show you 15 ways you can use your pawns to gain an edge. Now, I'm going to start with the very basic, kind of pretty obvious things that I think a lot of people understand, and we're going to move through more intermediate and advanced ways to use your pawns. Make sure you watch all of them though, because even if you pick up one or two new ideas that you didn't know about pawns, it could really be a game changer for you. So I think you guys are going to learn a lot from this. I put a lot of time putting this together, but let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, the first way you can use your pawns to gain an advantage is to get control of the center. So if your opponent allows you, you can get two pawns in the center just like this. This is almost always a good thing to do when you can do it, because you're controlling these vital central squares. It prevents your opponent from moving any of these higher valued pieces onto those squares and really hinders what they're trying to do. So if possible, always get these two pawns in the center. All right, the next way you can use your pawns is by forking your opponent's pieces. So let me give you a quick example here. We play d4, and now our opponent makes a huge blunder, bishop to e6. If you'd like to pause the video and figure out what we should play, this one's not too hard, but I'll give you a chance to do that. And if you've had a chance to look at this, the move is d5. By playing pawn to d5, we're creating a double attack, also known as a fork. And black has the problem that they can only move one piece at a time. If they try to move the knight to safety, well, then we take the bishop. And of course, if they try to move the bishop to safety, then we take the knight. So either way, they're going to be losing a piece for a pawn, which is a very good trade for us. And this is very common actually at the lower levels at the start of the game, because you have usually there's lots of pawns kind of sitting around the center. And as people try to develop their pieces, if they're not paying attention, they can fall into this fork. So always keep an eye out for that. And the same, if you're playing the other side of the board, watch out that you don't put your pieces like that where they can be forked by your opponent's pawn. All right, the next way you can use your pawns, and this one is pretty obvious, but at the end of the game, whenever you have a passed pawn, which in this case, this is considered a passed pawn because there's no pawns that are either directly in front of it or on the adjacent file that could capture it when we try to move it forward. So because of that, this is a passed pawn. These are also considered passed pawns, all of these, but ours is further advanced, and the king is too far away to stop it. So we can use this pawn to become a queen. Okay, so at the end of the game, definitely want to keep this in mind, because if you're able to get a queen first, most likely you're going to win. Even in this example, even though black has so many pawns, it doesn't matter. Once you get the queen's going to be able to capture all the pawns, and you should be able to win easily. All right, the next way you can use your pawns is to shield your king. So as an example, here's just a game where players are developing their pieces, and now we castle. Once we castle, notice how we have these nice 3 pawns directly in front of our king. This is a great shield because it blocks pieces. You can see it's blocking this bishop from getting to our king. If the queen ever came over here later, right now it wouldn't really make sense, but later on it would be blocked by the pawns, and it would be couldn't be able to get to our king. Now, one thing about this, when you castle, your pawns are almost always better if you just keep them on their starting squares in a line, because you can see how when they cover everything, there's no gaps, right? Like all of these squares are covered. There's no empty squares for a piece to get into. But if we play, let's just say, for example, we play the move g3, well, now we've created some holes here, and there's no longer a pawn covering these 2 squares, right? Same thing if we play h3, you might say, well, it's still covered by this f pawn. Well, actually it's not, because this bishop is pinning it. So if black wanted to, they could hop their knight right in there and start to, attack our pieces, get close to our king. We wouldn't be able to take because of this pin. So you see, it's usually better to just keep them in a line. Don't move them forward, especially in front of your king, because every time you do that, it makes a weakness. And so you really have to be careful before moving your pawns forward in front of your king. All right, so we've talked about kind of the very basic and obvious ones that you've probably heard and seen before. Now we're going to move on to some more intermediate and advanced ways to use your pawns. So the next one is you can use your pawns to cramp your opponent's position. So a good example of this would be the French opening and then the advanced variation. So this is called the French defense when black plays e6 and d5. And then if we play e5, this is the advanced French. And one of the reasons why you might consider playing this as opposed to capturing or defending your pawn is because you cramp black's position. Notice how this pawn on e6 is blocking the bishop. So that bishop really doesn't have anywhere to go. It has one square to move to. That's it. This knight can't develop to its normal square because your pawn is controlling it. This bishop can't go here. It can't go here because your pawns are controlling it. So black doesn't have a ton of options when it comes to developing their pieces because of how your pawns are advanced forward. And most of the time, white is going to be the player who has the option to push forward, right? Just because of the way the game works, you start first, you get your pawns out there first, and then like we saw here, if black counter attacks you, then you can choose, do I want to push by and gain the space advantage or not? And so it's pretty common that you'll see a lot of players who are playing the white pieces get into these positions where they have a space advantage, and if you're playing with black, a lot of times you're playing from a more cramped position. So keep that in mind. Look for opportunities when you can push forward, and a lot of times it makes life difficult on your opponents. All right, the next way you can use your pawns is by wasting your opponent's time with something that's known as a gambit. So when you play a gambit, you're giving up your pawns for free, but the free part is that your opponent has to spend a move to actually capture the pawn. So here's an example. This is the Danish gambit. This is one of my favorite gambits, but we give black this pawn, then we play c3, we give him this pawn, and then we play bishop c4, and we give him this pawn. And at the end of everything, you notice how we've sacrificed 3 pawns, we've only gotten 1, so it's a net sacrifice of 2 pawns, we've given up 2 pawns. But what do we get in return? Well, while black was busy capturing, we were getting our pieces out. So we have 2 bishops ready to go attack black's king or whatever, his king side, and black has no pieces developed, like nothing has been developed, right? All they've done is just taken these pawns. So that's kind of a theme for gambits. A lot of times you get a lead in development because your opponent was busy taking those free pawns, but a lot of times you can get really good attacks, you can get quick checkmates. If you're an aggressive player and you're good at tactics, gambits are probably a good way to go, and you definitely want to be thinking through things like this. All right, and real quick, I want to give you a little bonus tip here while we're talking about this gambit idea. So there's one particular thing that happens sometimes in chess where, just want to go through these moves, where you've developed your bishop, like in this case from to f4 from c1, and there's a pawn over here, the pawn in front of your knight that's undefended. It can happen on both sides of the board. I think the queen side is a little bit more common, but it can happen over here as well. But your opponent attacks it with their queen, okay? And a lot of people, when they see this, are like, oh, I gotta like defend it, or I have to maybe play b3 to block the queen from taking it or something like that. But another option that you have, and this is what I really prefer to do, and it's a lot of times it's the best option, sometimes it's not, but most of the time it actually is, you can just let them take that. And so for example, I would play knight here, and I would say go ahead, take that, and then I would play rook b1, and then they could actually take another pawn. But what have we done? Well, we've done the same thing that we do when we kind of play gambits, right? They're wasting time moving their queen so many times, right? 1, 2, 3. And what have we done? We've been getting our pieces out, ready to go. We've got this rook on a great spot. So we've got 4 pieces active. They only have their queen. So this is an option that you want to consider. Now we can just strike back with e4. And actually the engine says white's slightly better here. So even though we're down 2 pawns, we have a better position because we have all of our pieces out. So keep that in mind on these b and g pawns after your bishops move out. If the queen ever attacks them, this can be an option. Okay, so yeah, just wanted to mention that. All right, the next way we can use our pawns is to dominate our opponent's knights. If you've never heard that phrase before, don't worry, I'm going to explain it right now. So here's an example. We bring our knight out, we play g3, and our opponent does this little maneuver. Sometimes you'll see your opponents do this, where they bring the knight towards the center, and then they bring it up here in front of the b or g pawns. That can happen on this side of the board as well. But one of the easiest things to do against this is to just move your pawn forward to where it's controlling the squares that the knight would like to move to. It's a very simple thing to do. You just push the pawn forward, and immediately that knight is suddenly very awkward. It's like, what is it even doing there? It's probably never going to want to move here. And that all you have to do is make 1 pawn move, right? And you completely control any type of aggressive moves that knight might have wanted to do, okay? And in this case, it's even better because we can fianchetto our bishop, and it looks like a pretty nice move anyway. But a very easy way to control your opponent's knights. And it can happen in other ways as well. So if we back up a little bit, let's just say that black had played knight c6. Another way that we could dominate this knight is by playing c3, right? Same idea. We're using our pawn to control the squares that the knight would like to move to go forward. Now, of course, they can try to maybe come around a different way like this, but usually the best ways for the knights to attack you is to just immediately go forward, right? And when you take that away, it makes life difficult for your opponent, okay? Same kind of thing here. Black could play the move f6. It dominates our knight. We can't really move it forward. Now, this is a risky move because it opens up the king, but you understand what I'm saying. This is what dominating a knight looks like, and usually it's a very easy and simple thing to do, and makes it tough for your opponent to know what to do with their knight. All right, the next way you can use your pawns is to block files and or diagonals. So a super simple example is the 4-move checkmate usually happens when white brings the bishop to c4, and then the queen either to h5 or f3, and then checkmate on f7, right? One of the easiest ways that I tell beginners to stop the 4-move checkmate, if they're very, very, beginner still learning, is to just play e6 at the first move. Play the French, because what happens if white puts the bishop there? You've already blocked off that bishop from going to f7 with your pawn, and there's no chance that that's ever going to happen anytime soon, right? This is very well defended. There's 3 things defending it, and white just has no way to get past that. You just completely shut down that diagonal with the simple move. And actually you can play d5 and even chase the bishop some more, right? But even if you didn't, it's just shut down. That's it. There's no more threat along that diagonal, right? Very simple concept, but you want to be looking for this in other aspects of the game as well. Let me give you one more example. All right, so here's a position where black has just decided to bring the rook over to the half open file and attack your pawn on b2. Now, one option that you could do is defend it, right? You can maybe bring this rook over, and maybe you could put your queen here, or you put your queen here, and that's not a terrible idea. But then black's probably just going to pile up again, right? Now you have to like, okay, let's defend it again, and maybe they'll bring the queen over and attack it again, right? And you can see how that's pretty annoying. If we go back here, very easy thing to do is to just play b3, and guess what? That rook is no longer bothering your pawn at all, right? You've got 2 pawns defending it. Even if they somehow went here and traded off a pawn, it's still going to be defended by a pawn, one of these pawns. And you have nothing to worry about. Okay, so very easy and simple thing to do when there's a file that you want to block off. You just push the pawn forward, it blocks off the file and really makes the rook, queen, or whatever very much less effective. Okay, so keep that in mind. You can block off files, you can block off diagonals using your pawns and stop whatever your opponent's trying to do. All right, so I'd say that the last couple that we looked at were kind of more intermediate level, and now we kind of start to get to the section where we're a little bit more advanced, okay? So the next way that you can use your pawns is to open up lines and files to attack your opponent's king. And one of the common ways that this happens is when your opponent has not castled, you use your pawns to bust open the center and take advantage of that. So let me give you a little example here. This is from the King's Indian Defense. So I just finished my course on that. If you're interested, links below. But one of the lines that I cover is the 4 pawns attack, right? And we castle, and then if they play e5 right away, okay, what we do is we drop our knight back. Let's say they play knight f3, then we play c5. And what we're doing is using these 2 pawns to basically bust open the center and take advantage of the fact that white's king is still there. We've already castled. We're nice and safe. We're ready to, if we need to, bring our rook over and use that. And white has not castled. White still has at least 2 more moves before they can castle. So we're not going to wait around. We're going to strike back immediately. And just to give you an example, if white decides to capture and we are able to open up the center, we're going to take back this way. For an example, something like this could happen. And even if queens get traded here, let's go queen takes, rook takes. Actually, we take with the knight first. Then we take with the rook. And you might say, well, it looks pretty even. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pawns, 6 pawns. It's actually not even at all, and here's why. First of all, white's pawns are extremely messed up. These are isolated pawns. These are doubled pawns, and ours are like super nice and pretty looking, right? Which is a good thing. That's an advantage. And our bishops now are ready to go. Our rook is involved. Our king is totally safe. And look at white's king. White's king's like, I don't know where white's king's going to go. Even though the queens are off the board, like it's still very, very risky for white. We're going to develop this. We are going to, I mean, we could even think about capturing here and giving white tripled pawns. The point is, we used our pawns to open things up at a moment when it was advantageous to us, right? Like we were castled, white was not. White was getting all this extra space, and so we needed to strike back and just break things open so that our pieces could get out and become active. And we have to use our pawns to do that, right? So that's the takeaway. That's the thing that I want you to remember. This is very common, like I said, when you have castled and your opponent has not castled. It's almost always a good idea to open up the center in that case. And if we flip it around, it's almost always a bad idea if you're white to be doing that. So like in this case, a much better move for white would probably be d5. I think black is still in a better position, but at least by playing d5, you're somewhat keeping the center as close as you can and not letting black kind of open it up. So yes, I know that was a lot, but the takeaway, use your pawns to open up the center when it's an advantageous moment for you, like when your opponent's king is still there. All right, the next way you can use your pawns is to do what's called a pawn storm to attack your opponent's king after they've castled. So as an example, let's just go through this opening. This is just Sicilian defense main line here, and I'm just kind of doing some random moves, but there's this setup that you can do as white, where you put your bishops here, you put your queen on d2. Usually you're going to castle queenside, and then a lot of times your plan is going to be to push these pawns forward. Sometimes you'll play f3 first, and then g4, h4, maybe something like this, h5, g5. You push your pawns, and you attack the king. And then black usually is going to do the same thing. So if you look at it from black's perspective. While you're pushing your pawns over here and trying to attack over here, black's going to be pushing their pawns. The point is that if you can get your pawns to trade off, for example, let me just actually make some moves here. Let's say bishop e6, let's say we castle, black plays rook c8. Let's just say, for example, h4, h5. This is probably not the greatest, these aren't the greatest moves. Let's say queen c7, h6. Now, I wouldn't play h6 because black would probably play g6, block everything off. But if they take, okay, this is the point, right? We take, we've opened up the file for the rook. Our bishop is involved, our queen can come over, this bishop, everything is, it's very easy to get to black's king. Okay, now, of course, I didn't play the best moves for black, but this is the point. This is kind of the goal. Now, you have to be more tactful when you do that. Usually, you're not going to just randomly push one pawn. You're going to kind of push two together, and it gets very complicated, very tricky. But by using two pawns together, usually you can force at least one of the files to be open. Sometimes it's the H file, sometimes it's the G file. And then your rooks can get involved, and it's much easier to get to the king and checkmate. And of course, black's going to be doing the same thing over here, probably, if they know what they're doing. But pawn storms with your pawns on a king that's castled. That's one of the best ways to attack it. And yeah, just keep that in mind. You use your pawns to create pawn storms to attack the king. All right, the next way that you can use your pawns is to take away key development squares from your opponent. So as an example here, let's say we play e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, d6. And let's say we were afraid of this bishop coming here and pinning our knight to the queen, and we wanted to prevent that. Well, an easy way to do that is to play h3, and guess what? We don't have to worry about that anymore. Now, you do want to be careful with this because I see some people that they start the game and they just kind of like, if there's ever a bishop that can go there, they just immediately play h3. If there's ever a bishop that can go over to b4, they just immediately play a3. And the problem with that is, yes, you do accomplish the one thing of preventing the bishop from pinning your knight. So that's good. But the downside is you're not developing any pieces, right? And so if you're always just making these pawn moves and your opponent is just kind of like, well, I'm just going to keep developing my pieces, you might find yourself in a situation where you're very behind in development. So you want to be careful and use this with caution, but sometimes it does make a lot of sense because, you know, for example, if you play d3, the bishop comes to g4, and you allow the knight to come in, well, now you might have a problem where there's a lot of pressure on your f3 knight. Now, in this case, it's pretty easy to deal with. You can play h3, you could play c3 to even prevent the knight from coming in. You have other options, but just keep that in mind. You can use your pawns to take away those key squares that your opponent's pieces might want to go to. And that's just an option you have. All right, this next tip is a little bit different because it's a way that you can use your opponent's pawns to help you, okay? And you can use your opponent's pawns to protect your own king. Now, that probably sounds really weird, and you're like, what are you talking about? How can my opponent's pawns protect my own king? Let me give you a good example. So there's this weird line in the king's gambit I want to show you. Play f4, this is the king's gambit, and then there's bishop c4, which is a line that I've played, and then there's this bishop e7 move black can do. These are some weird lines, but it illustrates a very important point here. So we're going to play knight f3, they put us in check. We can play g3 and then castle, and this probably looks crazy. Like, why would we do this? We're castling where we have no pawns. What's going on? They take us, and then we don't even take the pawn. We play king h1, okay? I know, this is crazy stuff, right? But here's the thing. Your opponent's pieces, like let's just think, for example, rook and queen are long-range pieces that can move straight. Can they go through this pawn to get to our king? Like, can this rook put us in check along this file? No, not unless we take this pawn and this bishop and this pawn, right? And let's just say even if these were gone, this rook can never put us in check unless we decide to take that pawn. If we leave it sit there and we just leave our king, that can sit there all game, and black never has an option. Now, of course, we have to watch out for other things, right? Like if a knight ends up on this square and puts us in check, well, that's going to be a different story, right? Or if a bishop somehow was here on this diagonal, that's going to be different. But along this file, we are completely and totally safe as far as our king is concerned. And it's because this is a black pawn. If you imagine this was a white pawn, one of our own pawns, black would be able to pile up the queen and the rook and the bishop and just attack it and take it and checkmate us, right? At some point. Because it's their own pawn, they can't do that, okay? Now, this is a weird opening. I'm not saying that you should go play this opening, but this idea, okay, the idea of not taking your opponent's pawn comes up in a lot of times when they're attacking you. Okay, they're attacking you with their pawns, and you have the option to say, you know what? I'm not going to take the pawn. I'm just going to slide my king over and use it as a shield. That's basically what we're doing. We're using it as a shield to guard our king. Okay, so this is kind of an advanced concept. It doesn't show up all the time, but when it does, it can be a huge, and it can save you from getting checkmated. Okay, so keep this in mind when your king is under attack. All right, the next way you can use your pawns is by doing what's called a minority attack. I recently did a video where I talk about how to do a minority attack. You can go check that out. I'll link that below if you want to see more details on this. But for right now, I'll just give you the very high level overview. And a lot of times this comes up in these Queen's Gambit declined type of lines where you trade the C pawn for the E pawn. Okay, and you get this pawn structure where black has 4 pawns like this, and you have these 2 pawns here, and then there's the empty C file. Okay, and so we get something like this, let's just say. And now would be a good time to potentially consider doing the minority attack. The reason it's called the minority attack is if you look at these 3 files, you've got 2 pawns and black has 3. Okay, so you're attacking with the minority of pawns. That's why it's called a minority attack. And what's the point? Well, if we're able to, what we would like to do is probably, let's, it's black's turn. Let's say black plays rook here. We'll play rook b1. I don't know, black's going to make some maneuvers over here. We're going to play b4, knight g6. And just for the sake of this example, I'll play b5. I'm making this easy for myself. I'm not really trying to prevent this with black. We're going to take here, okay? What did we accomplish by pushing that pawn up and taking? Well, we created a target. This pawn on c6 is now a target for us. This is what's called a backward pawn. We can do something like knight c5 to blockade it. And eventually, we are going to be piling up our pieces on the c file and attacking that pawn on c6. We can bring our knight in. We can bring this knight in and trade that off and then take it maybe. That's the point. You give yourself a target, okay? And it all starts from the minority attack where you push your pawn up. Like I said, go watch that other video if you want more details on exactly how to do that and see an example. But it's very hard to stop. And once you learn this idea, I think you're really going to like it. It does take some practice and some getting used to, but keep that in mind. Minority attack can be a nice way to create a weakness that you can then attack. All right, the next way you can use your pawns is by not moving them forward. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that doesn't make any sense, Delson. Well, what I mean is every time you move a pawn forward, okay, let's just take this one, for example. This is a pretty bad move to start the game with. Every time you make a pawn move forward, you are creating some weaknesses somewhere on the board, right? In this case, we have now opened up this diagonal and this diagonal, right? If a piece were to end up here like a queen or a piece were to end up here like a bishop, they can get through and attack something, right? Our knight or our king. When that pawn was back on f2, that wasn't an option. That diagonal and this diagonal was closed, okay? So when you decide which pawns you're moving, you are always giving up something, right? When we play e4, we are giving up the fact that this is open. Now, in this case, it's actually a benefit to us. We want that to be open because we already have it controlled by our pieces and it lets our pieces out. Same thing with d4, right? We are okay with that because it lets our bishop out. Now, it does open up our king, but this is a well-known example, and if the bishop ever comes here, you have lots of options, right, to stop the check. So it's not a big deal, okay? But you have to realize, every time you make a pawn move, it doesn't matter what it is, where it is, you're giving up something in return. In this case, we're giving up control of this square. Maybe it's not a big deal in this case, right? But this is what you have to think through. And I want you to think about something. I noticed this a long time ago when early in my chess career, but like a lot of strong players, they will do things like push their pawns up in very specific ways. So for example, they'll fee and kettle the bishop, right? So they create some weaknesses, but they immediately fill those weaknesses with their bishop, right? So it's like, okay, they move the pawn, but then the weaknesses are filled. Or a lot of times you'll see people, they'll kind of move their pawns forward in pairs like this, right? Where they're very good at controlling the weaknesses and they make sure that there's nothing happening along the diagonals that the pawns are no longer blocking, right? So I'm not sure if I'm explaining this well, but the point is, if you can think twice before you move a pawn forward, you're actually going to save yourself in the long run. And like, for example, what this looks like, let's say I'm playing a game, okay? And let's say I play here, we'll go here, and my opponent plays this move. See, it's a very, normal looking move, like, okay, they just push their pawn forward. As soon as I see that, I'm happy as white. Why am I happy? Because by pushing this pawn forward, they now have created a hole on d5 that no pawns will ever, in this game, never will a pawn be able to control that square. A black pawn, right? Never. It's not going to happen until they restart and play a new game. So what does that mean for me? Well, my knight's coming to c3. My knight's coming to d5. and this knight is going to sit here all game. And even if they try to put their bishop and maybe take it, well, guess what? I've got my bishop. Now my bishop's going to sit there all game. And maybe I'll even maneuver this knight around to get control of that too, right? So for example, I can go 1, 2, 3, and now I have the knight controlling that, or I can do something like this, have the knight controlling that. But because there's no pawns, that's a huge advantage for me. If black tries to do the same thing, bring their knight in, guess what? I've got this little pawn over here, boom, like, bye-bye. Like, that knight has to go, right? So this is something that a lot of beginners, even intermediate players, don't think about, and you really need to think through very carefully, which pawn am I moving forward and why, and what weaknesses am I creating? If this person were to play c6, that's a much better move, because look at how all of these squares are covered. There's no holes or weaknesses that I can take advantage of, right? So sometimes not moving your pawn forward is one of the best decisions that you can actually make. All right, guys, and for the last way to use your pawn, I've saved the best for last, but this is a position we've seen before. And the way you can use your pawn is by performing a magic trick and fooling your opponents by capturing their pawn like this. And you'll leave them speechless, and they really won't understand what's going on. Okay, I'm totally kidding, but for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, this is en passant. This is a special move in chess, and sometimes beginners, when they see it, are like, wait, what just happened? How did you just take my pawn? You can't do that, right? So, yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there as the final one. Of course, it's not always the right decision to take en passant. Just because you can do it doesn't mean that you should, but it is an option for you. And remember, you only have one chance to do it. You have to take it like this. It's when a pawn advances 2 squares, lands side by side your pawn, you do have the option to capture it. That was mostly a joke, but if anyone hadn't seen that, well, now you know. That's en passant special pawn move in chess. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you learned something, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't. It kind of helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people, which I appreciate. And if not, that's okay too. I'm just glad that you guys learned something. As always, stay sharp, play smart, and take care.